Good morning. You know when the news is coming at you a mile a minute, it's almost impossible to even process it all.
Yeah.
That's kind of where we are right now with this conflict that's just exploding in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah.
Right.
And then always that looming shadow of Iran sort of hanging over everything. It's chaotic, it's emotional, and honestly, it's pretty scary. So today, let's do what we do best here on the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
Let's cut through all the noise.
Yeah.
Our goal, like always, is for you to walk away with a rock-solid understanding of the core pieces of the forces at play here.
Right.
But I also want to kind of pose a question to you. I want you to think about this as we go through all this material.
Sure.
In a conflict like this one, are there any good guys? Or is it all just shades of terrible choices?
It's so tempting to want to simplify things,
Mm-hmm.
to find that classic hero and villain narrative. But what I find so fascinating about this particular conflict is that it really defies those easy labels. You have layers upon layers of history and grievances and political calculations, all colliding in a way that makes it almost impossible to untangle.
Okay, so where do we even begin to untangle this knot?
Yeah.
It seems like the match that lit this whole fire was Israel's attack on Iran early Saturday morning.
Mm-hmm.
But the details are still so murky.
Yeah, we know that Israel struck targets inside Iran. But the exact nature of those targets, the extent of the damage, it's still unclear.
Right.
What is crystal clear, though, is that this was an incredibly bold move by Israel.
Yeah.
A preemptive strike that sent a very, very strong message.
Then just hours later, you had this horrifying truck attack in Israel.
Yeah.
A large truck just plowing into a bus stop
Yeah.
full of senior citizens near Tel Aviv.
Yeah, full.
The attacker was killed by a civilian who was there. But just the image of that scene is just chilling.
Absolutely. And this attack immediately raised the specter of terrorism, of retaliation. And whether it was directly connected to the events in Iran or not, it absolutely poured gasoline on an already incredibly volatile situation.
It feels like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see how Iran would respond.
Right.
Their supreme leader did make some statements,
Yeah.
but they were surprisingly measured.
You know what? I think that measured response is one of the most intriguing aspects of this whole thing.
I agree.
He acknowledged the attack, condemned it,
Right.
but he stopped short of making any direct threats of retaliation. It almost feels like a calculated chess move, leaving everyone guessing what their next move might be.
So you have all this tension ratcheting up, and then we start hearing about these increased casualties among Israeli soldiers in Lebanon.
Right.
It's a reminder that this isn't just a war of words. There are real lives being lost on multiple fronts here.
Absolutely. And the casualties in Lebanon signal a significant escalation of Hezbollah's involvement.
Right.
And remember, Hezbollah is a powerful, very well-armed force in Lebanon, and they have very close ties to Iran. So their actions are going to be crucial in determining how this conflict ultimately plays out.
Then you throw in these attempts at a ceasefire, which seem to be falling apart before they even really began.
Yeah.
Egypt proposed a 2-day ceasefire, but both sides seem to have these conditions that the other just won't accept.
Yeah, and it really highlights the deep divisions and the conflicting goals
Yes.
that are at the heart of this conflict.
Exactly.
Hamas is demanding a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, which is just something that Netanyahu has absolutely refused to consider. So these entrenched positions make finding common ground, even for a temporary pause in the fighting, incredibly difficult.
And domestically, Netanyahu is facing intense pressure.
Oh, absolutely.
There were protests that erupted during his speech,
Right.
people blaming him for security failures.
Yeah.
For the hostage situation. It paints a picture of a country that's deeply divided, even as they face these external threats.
I think those protests are incredibly significant. They show that this conflict isn't just playing out on battlefields. It's also creating these deep rifts within Israeli society itself. Netanyahu's leadership is being questioned. And that internal pressure could have a real impact on his decision-making going forward.
And speaking of pressure, there's the horrifying situation with the American hostages being held by Hamas.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
Reports suggest there could be as many as 7.
Wow.
And there are even rumors that some may already be dead. It just adds a whole other layer of tragedy and urgency to everything.
It injects a level of human cost that's just impossible to ignore, and it also raises the stakes significantly for any potential military action by Israel. They have to weigh the risks of escalating the conflict against the safety of those hostages, and any misstep could have devastating consequences.
And it's not just physical attacks that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Hezbollah issued what they called an evacuation order for an Israeli town.
Right.
They even released drone footage.
Really?
It's unclear if this was a genuine warning or just a form of psychological warfare,
Wow.
but it definitely had an impact.
I think that evacuation order is a prime example of how psychological tactics are being used alongside those military ones. Hezbollah is trying to sow fear and uncertainty,
Oh, yeah.
disrupt daily life, and really portray themselves as being in control of the situation.
Yeah.
It's a way of undermining morale and applying pressure without even firing a shot.
And they aren't the only ones employing these kinds of tactics.
Right.
There are reports of nighttime strikes in Beirut,
Yeah.
which seem designed to inflict terror as much as physical damage.
Exactly. Both sides are using these psychological tactics to try and gain some kind of advantage, to wear down the other side's resolve. It adds a whole other dimension to the conflict, one that's often overlooked but can be incredibly effective.
We also can't forget about the wider international implications of all this.
Mhm.
We've had reports of explosions near coalition bases in Syria,
Right.
and there were even attempted drone attacks on American forces,
Oh.
although those are still being disputed. It feels like this has the potential to spiral out of control and draw in other global powers.
And that's the biggest fear, isn't it? That this conflict could become a regional or even a global conflagration. And the situation in Syria is a perfect illustration of how quickly things can escalate. You have so many different factions operating there,
Oh, yeah.
each with their own agendas, and the slightest misstep could trigger a much wider war.
It's a lot to take in, even for someone like me who follows this stuff pretty closely.
I bet.
To help us make sense of it all, we need to look at what the experts are saying. The Institute for the Study of War has been analyzing the Israeli strikes on Iran, and their assessment is pretty sobering.
What are they saying?
Well, they're highlighting the strategic calculations behind Israel's actions. And they suggest that while those strikes may have been aimed at crippling Iran's immediate response capabilities, they may have also inadvertently strengthened Iran's resolve in the long term.
Oh, wow.
It's a complex equation with potentially unintended consequences.
It is.
And those consequences aren't just limited to the region itself. We've already seen a drop in oil prices following the strikes,
Right.
which shows just how interconnected the world really is.
Yeah.
Even events happening thousands of miles away
Yeah.
can ripple out and affect our daily lives.
That market reaction is a stark reminder that instability in one part of the world can have those far-reaching economic implications. It affects energy prices, consumer confidence, and even global political alliances.
Right.
This conflict has the potential to touch every corner of the globe in some way.
So we've gone from this surprise attack on Iran to escalating violence on multiple fronts. Internal tensions in Israel, a hostage crisis, and now the potential for a wider conflict that could draw in other global powers. It's a lot to process.
Before we go any further, I want to pause and just ask you, what's been the most surprising development for you so far? What's really sticking in your mind?
That's a good question. For me, it's that calculated ambiguity in Iran's response. They've chosen not to lash out immediately,
Right.
which leaves everyone guessing.
Yeah.
Are they planning a more strategic, delayed response? Are they trying to de-escalate, at least for now?
Right.
That uncertainty is a major wild card in this whole situation.
It is a huge factor. But I'm also struck by just the human cost of all of this. The casualties on all sides, the hostages caught in the middle,
Right.
the civilians living with this constant fear. It's easy to get lost in all the geopolitical maneuvering.
Absolutely.
But we have to remember that there are real people at the heart of this conflict.
Yeah.
And their lives are being shattered. And that human element is something that we absolutely need to keep at the forefront of our minds as we delve deeper into this conflict
Yes.
and its potential ramifications.
We'll do just that when we come back.
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, like the geopolitical chess game that's happening. But it's so important we don't lose sight of the human cost of all of this. Every statistic we talk about represents a real life, a story.
Right.
Yeah,
and it's those individual stories that I think often hit the hardest. Like we were discussing before the break, that truck attack, initially it seemed like such a straightforward case of terrorism.
Yeah.
But then hearing the driver's family saying that he wasn't politically driven at all,
Right.
it adds this whole other layer of tragedy to an already just horrible event.
It's a reminder that even in conflicts that seem so polarized, on the surface, they're never truly black and white. You have these individual motivations and personal struggles, mental health issues, all playing a part in the larger narrative.
Yeah.
It's a real cautionary tale against rushing to judgment.
And speaking of judgment, It's so difficult not to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of this conflict.
I know.
We've got multiple fronts, internal divisions, international players getting involved.
Yeah.
Where do we even go from here? What does all of this mean for the bigger picture?
It's like this ripple effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
One event triggers another, and pretty soon you have this whole cascading series of actions and reactions.
Yeah.
And I think to understand the potential trajectory of this conflict, we really need to consider the actions of those who are outside that immediate conflict zone. For instance, the reports of Chinese hackers targeting U.S. political figures.
Right.
That's a significant development.
It is, and it's almost like there's this shadow war happening alongside the physical one.
Exactly.
What are your thoughts on China's motives here?
It's tough to say for sure, but there are a couple possibilities. They could be gathering intelligence, trying to gain leverage, maybe even trying to disrupt the U.S.'s ability to influence the conflict in any way.
Right.
It really highlights how interconnected global politics are and how actions in one part of the world can have these serious repercussions.
Oh, yeah.
Far beyond.
And we can't forget about Russia, a long-standing ally of Iran. Could they be tempted to step in more directly,
Right.
provide military support, maybe even escalate things further?
Russia's involvement is a huge unknown right now. They have a lot at stake in the region, both strategically and economically. Their relationship with Iran is complex, and they definitely view Israel's growing power in the region with a lot of caution, so they could very well choose to get more involved.
Right.
But it's a risky move.
Yeah.
A miscalculation could lead to a much wider conflict that really nobody wants.
It's such a high-stakes game of strategy.
It is.
And unfortunately, those stakes are measured in human lives. We were just discussing the escalating violence in Lebanon. And the reports of Israeli airstrikes hitting ambulances are especially disturbing.
Absolutely.
I mean, is there ever any justification for targeting medical personnel and facilities?
Under international law, targeting medical personnel and ambulances is a clear violation.
Okay.
There are very specific, very limited circumstances where it might be permissible, like if an ambulance is being used to transport combatants or weapons. But even then, there are very strict protocols that have to be followed. So in this case, if those reports are accurate,
Right.
it raises some serious concerns about potential war crimes.
It's a stark reminder that even amidst the chaos and the fog of war,
Yeah.
there are laws and ethical boundaries that must be upheld.
Absolutely. And those violations have consequences, not just legal consequences, but moral consequences as well. They erode trust, they fuel resentment, and they make finding a path to peace
Oh, yeah.
that much more difficult.
Speaking of Hezbollah, it seems like they're trying to send a message of their own. With that evacuation order for Kiryat Shimona and now the rocket fire near the town, they're certainly not backing down.
No, they're not. And I think it's important to understand their motivations here.
Yeah.
Hezbollah sees itself as the defender of Lebanon, a resistance force against Israeli aggression. So their actions, while they are certainly provocative,
Right.
they're aimed at demonstrating their strength and their resolve both to Israel and to their own supporters.
It just seems like we're caught in this endless cycle of attack and retaliation.
Yeah.
Every action triggers a reaction.
Right.
And it's hard to see how this cycle can be broken.
It's a dangerous dynamic, no doubt, and it's one that's all too familiar in this region. And the risk is that each escalation brings us closer to that point of no return, where the conflict spirals out of control and the entire region is engulfed. It's a very sobering thought.
And a reminder that we can't just stand by and watch this unfold.
Right.
We have to stay informed. We have to engage in these constructive dialogues and advocate for peace, even if it feels like a distant hope right now.
Absolutely. Every voice matters. Every effort to promote understanding and compassion can make a difference. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of such a complex and seemingly intractable conflict.
Yeah.
But we can't give in to despair.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to turn our attention to the listener, tap into their insights,
I like it.
and hear their perspectives. So we're back, and before the break, we were talking about, how overwhelming this whole conflict can feel. It's easy to get caught up in that 24/7 news cycle and feel like there's nothing you can do.
Right.
But I'm curious, for our listener out there, what's been your biggest takeaway from all of this? What's resonating with you the most?
I think it's important to acknowledge that feeling of being overwhelmed. This is a very layered and emotional conflict, and that constant influx of information can be really paralyzing.
It really can.
But I hope our listener is starting to see those nuances,
Yeah.
the human stories, the way everything is so interconnected.
And I think that's what we do best here on The Deep Dive.
Right.
We help people connect those dots, understand the why behind those headlines. So as we wrap up here today, what's the one thing you want our listener to walk away with? What's the most crucial insight you can offer?
I think it's this. Don't give in to that temptation of oversimplification.
Yeah.
This conflict isn't about good guys versus bad guys.
Right.
It's about a complex web of historical grievances and political maneuvering and very real human suffering.
Mhm.
And understanding that complexity is really the first step towards finding any kind of lasting solution.
That's a powerful message. And to our listener, I'd add this. Stay engaged. Don't turn away from the news even when it's painful.
Right.
Keep asking questions, keep seeking out those diverse perspectives, and always keep those human stories at the forefront of your mind.
Yeah.
Because ultimately it's those stories that will remind us of the true cost of this conflict and the urgent need for peace. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next week with another complex topic ready to break it all down together.